Hello again. To conclude Chapter 11 with some more information on Korea and Vietnam. Korea, the bridge to the east, and they have been directly influenced by the Chinese. There are disputes between Chinese and Korean scholars over the origins of the Korean people. The relationship between the two countries is marked with tension and conflict, mainly because the Koreans perceive Chinese arrogance in terms of the older brother, younger brother Confucian relationship. Historically, there were three kingdoms. Kyrgyz, Silla, and the Pak were rivals from the 4th to 7th century Common Era. All three kingdoms began to absorb Chinese political and cultural institutions, and they accepted tributary status during the Tang Dynasty, but they forced the Chinese to withdraw to the Yalu River. The Japanese colonies in the south were eliminated, and the country was unified for the first time. The Silla rulers attempted to forge a centralized state, but this failed. Aristocratic families were very influential, and noble families began to argue, and in 780 Common Era, the king of Silla was assassinated, and civil war erupted. The Goryeo, or the Koryo dynasty, were able to take power early in the 900s, and they adopted the civil service examination in 958. And the aristocracy, just as happened in China, comes to dominate the bureaucracy, and for 400 years, the Goryeo dynasty will be in power. They developed industry and commerce, but agriculture is still the prime source of wealth. Noble families controlled their holdings, and peasants worked the land for them. The base people, or the Chanmin, are at the bottom of society. They are slaves, artisans, and specialized workers. The Chanmin live a life similar to European serfs. And the Goryeo era is marked by high achievement, and there are Buddhist monasteries that controlled vast territories and landed estates. Buddhist themes dominate art and sculpture. Here is the 1,000-armed Avalokitesvara, multi-armed. Under the Mongols, the kingdom became a tributary state. They paid tribute, and they forced these peasants and artisans to build a fleet that was used to try to invade Japan. And when the Yuan dynasty declines in China, the kingdom of Goryeo declines also. What were the main developments in Japanese history before 1500? The smaller dragon. The Vietnamese began practicing irrigated agriculture in the Red River Delta in the 2nd millennium before the Common Era. They had established a political state by 200, but there are tensions with the Qin dynasty in China. And by 100, during the Han, they were absorbed. But they are semi-autonomous until oppressive taxes by the Chinese forced a revolt. And in 39, the Trung sisters, widows of Han executed nobles, led a revolt on backs of elephants that briefly ended the Han rule. But they suppressed this, and they began to rule directly after this. Many officials were bewildered at the locals for how they went about. There's a lot of intermarriage over time, and a Sino-Vietnamese ruling class developed. And just like the French with their African and Asian colonies, the Chinese attempted to assimilate the Vietnamese. But even after 1,000 years of all of this Chinese influence in these various areas, the Viet never lost their cultural identity, even though the Chinese consider the Red River Delta as part of China. The Great Viet overthrew the Tang, and the Dai Viet is eventually established, and they have problems with the neighbors to the south, who have a lot of Indian influence in their culture. And there's numerous battles over the next 2 centuries, and by the end of the 1400s, the Dai Viet have taken control. In the late 1200s, the UN will attempt to conquer the Vietnamese, and they failed. They have never been conquered. By the 15th century, the Vietnamese are in control of their region once again. And they adopted many Confucian or Chinese ideas. Instead of the emperor, the rulers called the king. They adopted the court rituals. They believe in this idea of the mandate of heaven. And the Vietnamese monarch, above all, is the symbol and defender of Vietnamese independence. And they will fight to preserve their authority. There are many Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian ideas in Southeast Asia. There are many Buddhist temples. They're dedicated to the local village deity in the hope of guaranteeing a bountiful harvest, and we've seen this in other areas. A scholar gentry class developed, and they were exposed to classics of Vietnamese history along with Confucian classics. This helped to reinforce Vietnamese cultural identity, but the vast majority of people are peasants, sharecroppers, and very small landowners. But women in this part of the world have far more rights than Chinese women did. Since ancient times, Viet women were allowed to divorce and own property. There is a strong historical tradition of heroic women like the Trung sisters, and there's a famous picture of them in battle. How did they influence these regions? We have just talked about that. And that ends chapter 11.